Welcome back, everybody. We'll resume now. Is Mr. Fuller there? I can't see.
Well, we haven't got sound here, people.
What I think we might do, Ms. Tansley, you're sort of here and, on your own, as it were, and Mr. Fuller, oh, there you are. What we were thinking is, because you've got rather an extensive array of people to speak to us, are you happy that Ms. Tansley goes first? That way she's free to move on if she wishes to do so, rather than sit around most of the afternoon?
That's fine with us, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Tansley, does that suit you?
Yes, that suits me.
All right, over to you then. Just when you're ready, thanks.
I'm just turning my video on. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to talk. Essentially, my purpose of being here today is very, very briefly to support the development on Geraghty's Road, the western side of Geraghty's Road, and in particular relating to the Kiramuri Trust, which we'll be presenting a bit later this afternoon. So I don't have evidence or detail in that regard because we've been working on this, I guess, collaboratively with the Kiramuri Trust. So in effect, there's just a couple of things from my perspective I just want to comment on. The first one is when I was listening in earlier, I'm sorry, I've been a little bit on the road today, so I've been in and out a bit. But when I was listening earlier, there was a question I think that was asked regarding the nature of highly productive land, and particularly I think it was relating to the Buckland Road. The question related to Buckland Road area and Geraghty's. The answer to that was the Buckland Road area, I think that was given by Miss Trenuth, I think it was that the land is highly productive. I guess the one comment I'd make is that may well refer to Buckland, but it doesn't refer to the Geraghty's Road West. Geraghty's Road West properties are in effect small holdings, lifestyle type blocks, low value land, has no productive ability to them, or very little productive ability. In my property in particular at 42 Geraghty's Road, it is 1 hectare. It's got no economic value for growing at all, and I don't know that it ever did, or any of the land in that area ever did. So I don't believe that that applies to the Geraghty's Road area. In effect, I think the Geraghty's Road had been not included in a number of the development for reasons that I think are no longer valid. One of which I think related to the EnviroFert area, which really isn't, I think, an issue in terms of odour. And in fact, my property at 42 Geraghty's Road was never in the odour window in any event. But I don't believe that has kind of any bearings. So I guess I think about this in relation to the intent of a district plan review. And why would you develop, what's the benefit of developing an area like Geraghty's Road? So my comment would be, it is an area that is very close to schools, to public transport, to the township of Tuakau. The eastern side of Geraghty's Road, i.e. my neighbours, has been zoned residential area, which means there is development that does need to occur to Geraghty's Road and areas around it in any event. So given that the land on the western side is unproductive and small holdings, makes sense for it to contribute to growing the residential capacity of Tuakau. In addition, given that the Dromgools Road development area, I guess, is included, it also makes sense to me that if we were to develop the Geraghty's Road area, that you enable some collaboration regarding that infrastructure. So the only remaining barrier, it seems to me, to prevent this development is the infrastructure issue, which I believe can be addressed by, I guess, the contributions that you make in terms of development. And in effect, if you advise now of the intention to develop that area and contribute to the Tuakau residential zone in general, you can commence that work in that review now, rather than waiting for it to be a future urban area of development. So I think there's far greater benefits that I can see from the development being able to be zoned now, so that that work can commence, than it would be to hold off and then have, in effect, another set of costs, another set of development, another set of collaboration that would need to occur, rather than do it all in one. In the Kirimiri case, it makes for a very sensible kind of collaboration, because the property of Kirimiri is to the rear of my property at 42 Geraghties. It would be a staged development, which means you can develop directly off Geraghties Road now through the property that I own, as the early starter stages of developing the Kirimiri trust area. So those are probably my major points that I wanted to raise. So any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Ms. Tansley. We'll see if we do have any questions for you. Can we start with you, please, Ms. Sedgwick?
Certainly. Thank you, Ms. Tansley. Can you tell me, is your property on wastewater, town wastewater, or do you have a septic tank?
Have a septic tank.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, Ms. Tansley. Thank you very much. Very clear.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no questions. Thank you very much. No.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you very much.
Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me either. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
I wonder whether we can put up a Google map and check it, and Ms. Tansley can show us where her property is. Is it there?
Yeah, so you'll see that down, if you come down Geraghties Road, you'll come around the bend and you'll see that little red square.
Yeah.
That is the property, that's my property.
And the ones around you, how big are they? They look bigger properties, are they?
Yes, they are.
And is it just your property that's got, it hasn't got good soil, or is the whole lot?
No, not so. If you see where that boundary is, just where the cursor I think is, and you come down towards the western side, so come down, yeah. So those properties down from there are really what I'd call lifestyle blocks. They're not growing, they're not highly productive growing land. The area above it is, so the area in the yellow, just above where you see my little boxes, that is growing land currently.
Okay, thanks very much for that. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Tansley. I don't have any questions either, but thank you for your time today and for making your presentation to us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Righto, Mr. Fuller, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, panel. Today, the team is a little bit spread out, but we have some in the office. Craig Forrester, you can see on screen at the moment, with Sarah and a couple of the owners. Steve, maybe if you could turn on your video, just so that we can see you.
Trying to work that one out, Pete.
There you are. So that's Steve McCowan. He's the property owner at Jericho Road. And we also have, he's been on screen, Adam Thompson. So I think his camera's pointed up at the moment. But I'll start with some brief legal submissions, and then we'll just go to the owners and then the technical team. So obviously the panel has read the evidence and the submissions. And just to be clear about the relief that we are seeking, the owners of the Buckland area are seeking the country living zone as part of their relief, and or to be a receiver area for transferable development lots. So I appreciate that that's not the main focus today in terms of those provisions, but the panel will recall that we have provided quite extensive evidence in previous hearings, particularly the rural hearing, about those mechanisms and how this area could be part of that mechanism by being a receiver area. for lots to be transferred from other parts of the district. So, for example, from elite soils, and also from more remote areas of the district where you wouldn't necessarily want people developing lots, but may have, for example, SEAs. Those could transfer into the Buckland area, which is well located, obviously, next to facilities and the existing urban area, and is just across the road from the future urban zone of Auckland Council. So that's essentially the relief that is being sought. Now, I appreciate that the panel has received a lot of submissions seeking additional countryside living areas, and that the recommendation from the 42A reports has been to not increase or add any new areas. But with respect to most of those submissions, at least, I would like to distinguish the work that has gone on here. The Buckland people have pulled together and they have briefed leading experts, including going back to people like Dr. Vaughan Keesing in previous hearings, to support the provisions they're seeking. They're not actually just seeking necessarily to do subdivision as of right without benefits. There is significant environmental and ecological benefits from the approach that is being promoted, which is basically enhancement type subdivision. So I think there is a difference, and an exception is appropriate for this area, because extensive legal and technical work has been undertaken to support it. And I just would, in that context, refer you to obviously the very detailed planning report from Ms. Nairn, and showing how this rezoning does meet the higher order objectives of policies in the extensive Section 32 analysis she has also undertaken. So just in terms of the 42A report, there was a suggestion that because there's capacity, there's no need. Now, that was an argument that was certainly canvassed in the Cabra case, and it wasn't one that the court found attractive. The reality is that not all lots that may be vacant in rural areas are appropriate, and that this is an enhancement approach. So therefore, it's actually achieving environmental benefits. And Mr. Thompson can talk a little bit about some of the limitations on some of the lots in the district, and that some additional capacity is not inappropriate. The substitution argument, if you refer to paragraph 336 of the Section 42A report, there's an assumption made there that if we don't, for example, rezone Buckland, that those people would be better directed to live in existing towns through infill and appropriate greenfield expansion. In my submission, that's not the sort of substitution that people will adopt. There is a demand for countryside living. It's undeniable. We all know that. So how do we best manage it? And if you want a lifestyle block for your family or kids and the pony and all that sort of thing, it's not equivalent to go and live even in Tuakau, in an existing, even a village zone. You're actually seeking something different. And that raises the other issue of displacement. If you can't actually buy that property in a good location, in my submission, there's a greater risk to productive lots that they will be bought and underutilised for productive purposes, simply as a lifestyle, because there's no other blocks available. I am still probably increasingly concerned, as you would have seen from my submissions, that the officer, even this morning, unless I missed something, still has not really addressed, in my view, for the panel, the implications of the Cabra findings of the Environment Court for the Waikato area. I appreciate it's not a binding precedent in the sense that it has to be imposed, but the AUP provisions are now operative, and the court tested all of the arguments that I would submit have been raised against countryside living, and found that the mechanisms that we're promoting are meeting the purpose of the Act. And Mr. McCowan can actually go into this. He's sitting up in Maharangi at the moment. He can look out his window and see the development and the enhancement he's done there and talk about that. He's also got land at Jericho Road and at Waipa. So he knows Rodney, he knows the Waikato. And any suggestion that the same sort of general conditions don't apply, I suspect, is something that you could hear from him about. There is, just as a final point, just in terms of maybe a concern that there might be a floodgates of this approach, what we are suggesting is that this could be quite a limited area in Buckland, and as a limited opportunity near the existing urban area. It's a transition area. It's a better use to have right adjoining urban areas than rural production. And Mr. Forrester, who is very familiar with how these mechanisms work, because of the land values and the arrangements with TDRs, etc., the economics just mean that there will not be a flood of applications. It's quite challenging. The provisions in terms of enhancement are quite onerous, and there's a lot required there. So he can speak about the fact that there's, even with the historical provisions there's been some uptake, but it's not like there's going to be thousands of new lots created. So that's all I had to say, panel, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. We'll see if there are any questions for you now, but we may come back also at the end, but let's see how we go at the moment. Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marg?
Yeah, Mr. Fuller, are you able to elaborate a little bit further on point 17, the trial area that you refer to? What might that look like?
Yes, certainly, and a good question. I mean, I suppose one point is that, you know, that the Environment Court did test these things pretty thoroughly. So we don't necessarily say there is a need for a trial, but we recognise there is a bit of concern among officers. For example, it came up in the last hearing about how TDR mechanisms work, and the previous provisions, I think, and Mr. Forrester knows more about this than I do, were a little bit clunky. So in my submission, even if you weren't going to roll out something for the district as a whole, in my submission, this Buckland area could in fact be an area that is trialling TDRs for removal of sites from elite soils, for example, and then the council monitors it. Section 35, it monitors the performance over the next period, and then at any future plan review, it'll have a solid base for determining the efficacy of these provisions. It'll have some idea of, you know, the amount of areas that have been enhanced, the amount of uptake there's been. I suspect it'll be reasonably slow. But anyway, in my submission, there is quite a good little unique opportunity here to roll this out in a very limited way at Buckland and monitor it, even get some of the universities involved. I mean, you've got the University of Waikato. Have a look at what happens with the restoration of land, creation of wetlands, what happens with ecology when you do these sorts of developments. Do some baseline studies and see if you can partner with some institutions. It'd be a great little study area.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Marg. Ms. Sedgwick?
Thank you. Yes, I was also interested with that point on as a trial. But, the Section 42A author talked about country living should be considered strategically across the district and not piecemeal. And I wondered what your comment on that might be, Mr. Fuller.
In my submission, we are basically considering it in a wider sense. I mean, there's a little bit around Pocono, and you've heard from me about Pocono West. There's a little bit of country living in Havelock, and obviously you've heard that evidence. I think it is best located near centres. So in our submission around that Auckland area, we fully understand the cross-boundary issues, etc. But that's where the demand is coming from. It's spilling into the Waikato. We know that. It's been doing that historically. So I think that the strategic approach is, in fact, to look at where these people can be best accommodated with least travel, least other impact. I mean, if you basically have, under the provisions that are in the plan and have been, you've got some pretty remote areas that have opportunities with SEAs and things. And what we're saying strategically, it's best to try and get those people living on smaller lots in a better area that's better serviced and not sort of out in the boondocks.
Pony and one sheep. Thank you very much. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Fuller.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, Mr. Fuller, paragraph 8 of your legal submissions, you're critical of the 42A report author because she was involved in the Auckland Unitary Plan arguments about country living zones. That's a bit unfair, isn't it?
I suppose it's rather frustrating with respect to the author that, from my understanding, notwithstanding the significant effort that was put in by the Environment Court on exactly the same arguments effectively as she's raised, as Auckland Council put to the court, and the court didn't find favour with those arguments, that the panel hasn't been addressed on that.
Well, we're not, with all due respect, we're dealing with apples and oranges here, aren't we? There's no precedent effect from Cabra to us, and you know that. And we had this debate last time. With the Cabra decision, there was an agreement that between the parties that the TDRs would only enable subdivision in the country living zone. There was no re-subdivision in the rural zone, was there?
No, there's not. You're absolutely right, and there's donor and receiver areas, etc. But that's what we're thinking. But there is in situ opportunity within the Auckland Unitary Plan area as well, as separate to TDRs, from my understanding.
And there was policy support actually in the notified plan, the Auckland Unitary Plan, for TDRs. There's not in this plan, is there?
Well, that depends if you adopt, obviously, the package of objectives and policies and rules that we've sought through previous hearings. And you'll recall that we did seek effectively similar provisions to Auckland, but those have been tweaked previously by Mr. Hartley. So there is a framework there in our submission for a package to be applied.
But there was no dispute that there was a TDR mechanism available in the plan as notified. There was no dispute on that. There never was there, in the Auckland Unitary Plan?
In the Auckland Plan or the Waikato Plan?
Auckland Plan.
I think that some of the provisions from Rodney were rolled through, but and the panel endorsed those. But from my recollection, the Auckland Council didn't accept that part of the decision, and that's why the matter went to appeal. So that's the history of how it unfolded in Auckland. And there was a little bit, there was a little bit of some massaging, you might say, of the actual TDR rules in the Auckland process. Initially, they weren't found to be particularly workable, so they were improved in terms of what has now become operative.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying to you is that your legal submissions seem to be using the Cabra decision like a gun to our head, and I'm saying that's not the situation that is before us. What do you want to say about that?
I certainly wouldn't want to use that analogy, but what I'm suggesting is that the court has found that these mechanisms meet the purpose of the Act. And I don't see Cabra being addressed by the reporting officer.
I think we received at the last hearing legal submissions, didn't we? And I think you, from our legal advisor on this whole argument about TDRs and the difference between the Auckland Unitary Plan and what was notified in the Waikato Plan. Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that, and I accept the legal submissions that were made. I think that, it's not a binding precedent. I'm not suggesting that, and it's certainly not, as you've, I don't agree with the gun to the head in any way. But at the end of the day, the purpose of obviously the district plan is to give effect to the higher order policy documents and the RPS, and we're saying that this method is consistent with that, and I refer you to the analysis of previous witnesses, but also Ms. Nairn in this hearing. And also that if you're going right back to part 2, there's a whole thread of, it's not just Cabra, as I think I've alluded to, there's a whole 25 years of jurisprudence which says that this is good for the land. It brings benefits. And Mr. McCowan can certainly talk about from his experience, bearing in mind he's also a qualified agricultural scientist and valuer, that the you know, he can tell you what's going on out his window. It's probably best for him to speak to it as someone that is got some knowledge of how these have worked both in the Waikato and in the Auckland region.
Since the Cabra decision, we've had the NPS for freshwater, haven't we? And that provides for protection of sensitive areas, the fencing off of streams and rivers and the protection of wetlands.
Yes, that is certainly helpful, but I think that again, it's a technical area. But from my understanding, if you're really wanting to restore, and we've earlier in the process talked about the amount of the Waikato that has been degraded that needs to be restored. You know, it's $40,000 a hectare. It's not just fencing. If you're going to restore and replant and really get these areas providing good ecosystem services and water cleaning for the Waikato River and meeting those statutory objectives, etc., there's massive costs involved in planting. So the more hands to the pump, I'm not saying that some of those other mechanisms won't be helpful, but we've got a huge task, and particularly with climate change as well. I think, you know, in terms of seeing restoration as a key part of mitigation of CO2 emissions, etc.
All right, thanks, Mr. Fuller. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll divert now to Mr. Forrester, who's got some of the team there, and Mr. Brown is going to speak to his statement, I understand. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Brown. Just to reiterate what we've said to other folk during the course of this hearing and earlier ones, we have read your written statement, so you don't need to read that verbatim. You know, we're aware of the fact that you've been in your property for 30 years, how far it is around the outside of it, that it's about 18 acres, etc., etc. So we're really asking you to sort of give us the highlights package of what you want and why, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good afternoon, and panel. Thank you for this opportunity. My understanding was that you had some specific questions for me. I am impressed with your reading that you recall what I have summarised. So if you'd like to ask me some questions, I'm happy to answer.
If there's anything you want to highlight from your evidence, feel free. All I'm saying to you is we don't need you to read out chapter and verse. We're aware of what it is broadly you're seeking, but if there's anything that you want to point out to us, this is your opportunity to do.
Thank you. Predominantly, our attachments are towards Auckland rather than south into the Waikato. For me personally, I very rarely attend to any business or any socialising in the Tuakau area. So they see no reason why this northern belt within the district, the Waikato Council, couldn't become something really special. With detailed planning and plantings and etc., we could really make this quite a picturesque and dominant area. I'd like to give an example of my disattachment to the Waikato. I'm the director of a charity within an Auckland suburb, and it's been suggested to me over a number of years that my community involvement increase, but for that to happen in this specific area, I needed the approval of the local Member of Parliament, and in our location that is towards the Waikato, and for me to advance this further, I had to be involved within the community of Tuakau, which I just do not even shop in Tuakau. Anyhow, under the Electoral Act, there is opportunity to change your area that you vote in, and so I met the criteria, so I did that. Anyway, I went through the process of this new area of community service and have been approved for that. The Governor General has signed it off, and I'm about to be sworn in. But in my own area and where I live, I wasn't able to extend myself further in this area. And so I actually have a disconnect already with the Waikato area. My tendency is to move towards Auckland. My involvement in charity and organisation since the mid-70s has always taken me to Auckland, and therefore our natural thinking is that yes, we are Waikato residents, but our living style and methodology is urbanised into the Auckland Isthmus. And so therefore I have quite a disconnect to Waikato. So,
All right. No, I think we understand that. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Let's see if there's any questions for you if you're finished. Is that?
Yes, I'm happy
All right.
to take some questions.
All right, thank you. Let's see how we go with that. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, Mr. Brown, but thank you very much.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Yeah, hello, Mr. Brown, and I'm sorry to hear you obviously have given your all to your land, including your thumb.
Yeah.
I just wanted for you to just expand for a little bit to me. You talked about climate change and the reduction of livestock numbers. I just wondered how you reached that. Can you help me understand where you were going with that thought?
Well, feel that our submission is aligned partly to the climate change submission, that the draft that was put out in January this year, and I understand is in the process of further clarification now. But if our location can be urbanised more, it gives us opportunity to reduce our stock numbers. Our small acreage, our stock numbers are small in terms of productivity. And if we can urbanise more in this location, it will allow us to drop off our stock numbers. Basically, we run stock to pay our rates. That's the only purpose of the cows that I have. It's just to cover my rates and some of my insurances. And so if we can drop those numbers off, which would be in alignment with the climate change recommendations, it will allow the Waikato farmers that are true farmers to not reduce their stock units, but to actually do what they are good at doing. I am not good at raising cows.
Okay, I see where you're going. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb.
No, nothing. Thank you, Mr. Brown, but congratulations on your voluntary work.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just Mr. Brown, your disconnect, as you have said, as the Waikato is probably, I just got the impression from the comment you were making, it might be very unclear about the thinking within the Waikato as well, about country living zones and so on getting developed. So I think there's a fairly big gap in there of what you might be thinking about how the Waikato is thinking on this district plan. Would that be fair?
Well, I'm no town planning expert, and I don't understand the parameters around town planning. I'm more used to helping people with food banks establishment rather than the intricacies of the Waikato district and the makeup of those various zonings. My understanding is lacking, yes, on those matters. I guess I'm just a practical guy who loves the lifestyle block that I've lived in for 30 years. And I'd like to see that extended, that privilege to be extended to others within the submission area if our submission is successful. Does that help?
Yes, it's a fairly large piece of land of which you want to change the zoning on, isn't it?
1,000 acres, it is in terms of my 18 acres, yes, but in terms of longevity over the next gradual development over the next 10, 20 and 30 years, it's not a large piece of land. And if it's coordinated into good planning, then I don't see that large area of land as being large. In the long term, over 2 or 3 decades, I don't see that as a big piece of land at all, but I see it as a managed progression and a buffer between urbanisation down to 400 square metres of Auckland, and on the other side, a 100-hectare farm. So it gives us an ideal buffer zone. And so that 1,000 acres, no, I don't see it as being large when I look at it in a time frame of 20 to 30 years as it's gradually developed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Tuakau?
No, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Cooney?
Thank you.
No, I don't think I have any questions either, Mr. Brown. Thank you. That's pretty clear to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Brown. And we'll now call Mr. Johnson, who I think is also woken.
He hasn't arrived today, so we're just going to have to run with Perry Brown, who's just been.
Oh, thanks, Craig. So I'm not sure if the panel heard that, but apparently Mr. Johnson is AWOL. But that's okay. He's got a statement, and it was fairly brief anyway. So the panel have that, and also just to draw the panel's attention to obviously the other statements that have been made by residents that haven't appeared today. But otherwise, and that's within the Buckland area. So the next witness then is Mr. McCowan. Now, as briefly alluded to, Mr. McCowan is Middlemas, and that is the property at Jericho Road, which is obviously outside this area. But he has been doing a successful development there under the old rules in the Franklin plan. And therefore he can speak to that. And also he's been doing projects in Rodney. So as per the applicability of the provisions across that sort of geographic area from Rodney right through to the Waikato, he also has dairy farming operation in Waipa near Hamilton. He's pretty well placed to discuss any differences in terms of the actual conditions for this type of opportunity. So, Steve.
Thank you, Pete. Afternoon to the panel and Mr. Chairman. What would you like to hear from me? Peter's given me a very broad background.
Well, it's up to you to tell us what you want to tell us. As I've said earlier in the hearing, which you may or may not have heard, we're not that keen on you just reading out vast chunks of information that we've already read. We're very keen to understand your perspective on things, what it is you're seeking us to do, and why.
Okay.
But how you do that is up to you.
Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Basically, I've got a history of living on either farms or lifestyle blocks. And in that time, we've seen a lot of change, both the way we farm and also a change to the way urban people want to live, and that lifestyle blocks are now a very attractive place for urban people to live, as well as older rural people that will want to move out of their 1,000 acres or whatever it may be down to a small block and still feel that they're in touch with their roots. So to stop producing lifestyle blocks, I believe, as New Zealand's population grows, would be a great travesty, because the demand for them is huge, and even more so now with COVID-19 changing the way we all want to live. In terms of the real benefits that I see from an environmental point of view, and at the moment I'm sitting in my office looking over 12 odd hectares that we planted 5 years ago. Now, fortunately, we're reasonably close to the Tawharanui Regional Park, but we now know for a fact that we've got Kiwis living in our bush that's only 5 to 6 years old. Basically they've moved through into each of the 3 valleys that we've got. So to see that happen in such a short period of time is phenomenal. The other positive that we've got is that we are tying up carbon. And as you'll all know, the world's got a problem with heating. And the only way we're going to fix that is to try to soak up the carbon that we're producing as lovely humans. Native bush is a very good way to do that. It's not as fast as pine trees, but pine trees also don't produce an environment for Kiwis and the other native birds to live in. And the other positives with any sort of planting is that you're also going to tie up the phosphate and the nitrate that's moving across the soil profile into the streams, creeks, and then eventually into the rivers. The national policy statements that have been made in the last 12 months are good in that respect, but I believe that it's pretty limiting in terms of just how much nitrate and potassium and sediment is going to be stopped when you've only got a metre offset from the edge of a drain bank or 5 metres off a major stream. The type of development we've done in Jericho Road, if I remember right, we had to have an average offset of 15 metres. So that's very, very different to what's in the national policy statement. And the reason why it's 15 metres, from what I understand, from the ecologists that I've dealt with over the years, is basically what the science has told them works. The buffer against the water body is deeper, which in turn means there's more opportunity for the natural flora, fauna, and bird life and so forth to develop and live their normal life. And to be fair, that's what we've seen up here at Tawharanui with our place. You'll argue that, well, you know, there's no Kiwis down around Pukekohe. And in reply, I'd say, well, there were no kaka out here at Tawharanui 35 years ago, which is about when the ARC purchased the Georgetti farm, which was the Tawharanui Peninsula. The ARC in the last 30 years has basically planted 2 to 3 hectares of native bush a year, and they've done that continually, and they have worked on their hardest country. So they went in and fenced the top of steep valleys, they've fenced waterways off, and they've just slowly worked their way around the farm. Now, the ARC has got far deeper pockets than most farmers. The only way, from my experience in this game, that farmers can afford to do it, and I am a farmer, we farm 800 cows down in Nahanapuri in the Waipa catchment. I believe the only way that we can do this effectively in terms of planting out our wetland margins, our stream banks and so forth, is to incentivize it. And the cleanest way, from what I've seen with my experience in the Rodney District Council, which is now Auckland, is through incentivizing it via subdivision. And for example, in Auckland at the moment, you can plant out 5 hectares and produce an extra title, or you can do your wetland planting, which off the top of my head is around that 1 hectare to 2 hectares in total, just depending on the shape and size of it. And again, pick up a new title for doing that. What we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is a huge increase in costs. The kiwi fruit industry's gone ballistic, and that's put huge demand on the cost of posts, and posts are required to build a fence. So fencing is now one of the major costs of doing any type of native planting work. And then of course, we've got a huge amount of infrastructure happening in New Zealand with our roading. All of our new national, our state highways have all got intense plantings along the side of them. That in turn puts more pressure on that supply side in terms of price. So nothing's cheap and nothing comes for free. So the benefit for the landowner, for the farmer, is the ability to produce a title or titles, depending on how big their farm is and what options it has, with the ability to either produce those titles on their own property, or the ability to sell those titles as transferable title rights. And that basically means it gives all landowners or farmers within a region the opportunity to be incentivized and take advantage of that incentive to change their land use and become more environmentally friendly, as well as stay profitable. To me, it's simple. I've seen this happen over the last 25 years that we've been involved, either for clients or ourselves. And with the changes we've had over the last 3 or 4 years to the rural sector, with the way that we are going to have to farm over the next 15 years, I don't believe we've got any other option. New Zealand's a small place. We cannot cut the legs out from under our dairy industry and our sheep and beef industry and expect to live the way that we live now. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mr. McCown. Let's see if there are any questions for you. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, thanks, Mr. McCown. I've taken quite a few points from your talk and from your evidence. Obviously, one advantage is the discussion of a buffer between the Auckland boundary and Waikato boundary, the buffer between farm and city. Mm-hmm. The environmental benefits, you talked about carbon, native bird sediment controls. I mean, it's all very interesting, and you've obviously proven that works. But to do all of this, it costs money, and that's why you're proposing, these transferable lots. So have I got that in a nutshell?
Yes, you've got it in a nutshell. The transferable lots allow farmers that may not have a suitable house site for a lifestyle block, or they may be living in an area where the lifestylers don't want to live. It gives them the opportunity to do the development and sell that transferable title right to an area like we're proposing with the Buckland Group. And in time, the Buckland Group proposed area will eventually become urbanised totally. So I just see really good long-term planning coming into all of this. So there's a benefit right across the whole region and the whole country, and it's a win-win for everybody, especially the environment, with the changes that we're going to have to make in order to stay alive on this earth.
Thanks, Mr. McCown. Very, very concise. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Mr. Mark?
No, nothing from me, but thank you very much.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, Mr. McCown, the experience of a large amount of the Waikato that has country living zones and parts of it is that the land effectively becomes absolutely lost as productive land. So I think, and you would probably have to agree with that. there's other things that you do on the land, but most of them, after a while, they might want to start their living there, and then they all end up want to do is have a big ride-on mower to care for their properties. That's effectively what happens, though, isn't it? Isn't it a pattern that would develop there?
The problem with farming at the moment is it's very hard to make any money out of it. The dairy industry's had a really hard 5 years with an adverse climate and very poor payouts. The other issue that the industry's got is that we're not bringing through young blood into the industry. And that's because the money's not there. I'm a farmer. Both of my children have gone off into different industries. One's a mechatronic engineer, the other's a banker. They didn't want to go down the farming route. They just felt it was too difficult. Now I see that right through my age group and those that are older than me. And as we operate a large dairy farm, we're dealing with staff every day. And it really just makes my blood boil when I see the quality of people that we get to pick from to employ and have work for us as part of our team. Every year, the quality keeps dropping. We are not seeing quality people go through the universities. You only have to bring Massey University and talk to them about how many undergraduates they've got with their ag degrees, and do the same with Lincoln University, and compare it back to what was happening 30 or 40 years ago when I was a young buck at university, and it's chalk and cheese. The industry is suffering. We need to change the way that we think. And part of that is because we're going through a big climate change issue at the moment, and our current government's put huge pressure on the industry, which is going to force more change. But we do not have the quality people. We don't have the IQ within the industry to take us forward into the future. So we need to change. Maybe what we're talking about here is going to give the landowner, the farmer, another string to their bow in terms of options with that large asset they're sitting on out at Tikaraka or Waikaretu or on the edge of Pukekohe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thanks.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. McCowan.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Steve. And maybe just picking up on the Commissioner's sort of question a little bit, I think about mowing and things. A lot of the areas can obviously be just planted, and some of those lifestyle blocks in the future could be a lot smaller. In Whangarei, for example, these sorts of provisions, they're actually providing for 2,000 to 4,000 square metres, simply so you don't get all that big area that's unutilised and people riding on mowers. So there is a design element to that, I think, that can be addressed at the subdivision stage. Moving now to economics, and Mr. Thompson, I think you're online there. If you could unmute yourself and address the panel, thanks.
Good afternoon, panel.
Good afternoon.
I have a power cut, so hopefully the technology is not affected too much by that. So I just have a couple of quick points that I'll run through, if that's okay. I have looked at the historic uptake of lifestyle blocks in the district, and that sits at around 210 per annum. That has existed within a period of time where the supply has been relatively uninhibited. So it is a good indication of current and future demand, in my view. I would expect that to increase over time to 300 to 400 per annum relatively quickly, given the expansion of the Hamilton and Auckland areas and the increasing house prices in those locations, and the general move towards smaller lots in those urban areas, which I think over time will increase the demand for lifestyle blocks. In terms of the capacity in the district, how much lots can be supplied over time, I estimate 10,600 lots can potentially be supplied under the current district plan as proposed. And the council's economist, Dr. Fairgrave, estimates around 8,500. So given that annual demand of around 200 per annum, the district has about 40 to 50 years of supply. So the demand for these lifestyle blocks will be met one way or another in the district, and that really is a key concept, an important concept, I think, for the hearings panel to weigh up in their consideration of this proposal. There will be 200 lifestyle blocks per annum taken up one way or another in your district, given that level of supply. And the question really becomes, what is the optimal location and type of lifestyle block for the district, and whether you can incorporate additional economic and social benefits with that policy approach that you wouldn't otherwise have. Just one other point which I'll touch on briefly is the substitutability between different types of properties. My view is that there are a lot of lifestyle blocks of 5 or 10 or 15 hectares in the district that are presently owned as part of existing farms. And those would be on the radar of purchasers that are looking for a lifestyle block. So they are potential lifestyle blocks that are already in the existing rural area. And my view is that having some smaller lots of, say, 5,000 square meters or 1 hectare would be a good substitute for a large proportion of those people that are looking for that type of property. So instead of them taking a 5 hectare property or a 10 hectare property, I believe if they had an opportunity for a half a hectare or a 1 hectare property, that would be a good substitute for the majority of those purchasers. So I think that's an important consideration with regard to this policy question. Ms. Trenuth has obviously provided some analysis on this topic as well, considers substitutability as well, but she does so with regard to the substitutability between these smaller lifestyle blocks and a conventional suburban lot. And her assumption for her policy recommendation is that the purchasers of lifestyle blocks in the district would otherwise take up smaller suburban lots if that was what was available to them. I don't think that is a correct assumption. I think there's quite a difference between a suburban lot and a small lifestyle block, not least of which is the price. A small suburban lot with a house may be worth 600,000 or 800,000. By comparison, a lifestyle block with a house would be worth twice that, maybe 1.5 million, something like that. So the purchasers that are looking to move into the district for a lifestyle block will have a bit more money, and I think if they weren't given that opportunity, they would look at a different location for an equivalent price. So I don't think that substitution is likely to occur as assumed by Ms. Trenuth. That's really the two main things I wanted to run through. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thanks very much, Mr. Thompson. Can we start with you this time, Ms. Tiaho, please?
I don't have any questions, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Mr. Thompson, I've been wrestling with your numbers and those of the Section 42A author. So the around about 10, you said about 10,600 lifestyle blocks. That is, what am I trying to ask? Those are generally, would you suggest those are generally around about the 5,000 square metre, or are you including the much larger ones that you referred to of the 10 hectares type of block in that number, first of all?
So my estimate of 10,500 and Dr. Fairgrave's estimate of 8,500 includes existing properties and potential properties in the 5 to 20 hectare range.
Right.
And the reason why we've both selected that range is it's relatively small as an area of rural land, and that's the size that a purchaser would be after if they wanted a lifestyle block, roughly between a half a hectare up to 10 or 15 or even 20 hectares. But generally the preference is in the 5 to 10 hectare range, and those lifestyle blocks exist in the current rural property stock at the moment as existing titles that could be sold and used as a lifestyle block tomorrow with an existing use right for a house, or they could be subdivided under the proposed rural subdivision rules.
So what's your thoughts on the placement of lifestyle blocks? It's suggested that we should look at this strategically rather than piecemeal, but it seems as though every town wants some lifestyle blocks around it, which by its definition is piecemeal, I would suggest. What's your thoughts on that?
I think a good location for smaller lifestyle blocks is near the towns, because then you have access to schools and supermarkets, etc., and it's more efficient in that way. I think as Auckland moves further south, which it's doing quite quickly, and as Hamilton moves further north, as it's doing quite quickly in terms of the urban areas, and the prices of both cities increases rapidly, my expectation is that the demand for lifestyle blocks will jump well south of Tuakau and Pocono and well north of the top end of Hamilton, and start filling in the gap between those two main urban areas. So people will be more willing to drive to Huntly and out to the west coast from there for lifestyle blocks, because simply that will be on their radar in terms of what they can afford as the price of everything else increases. So the issue I believe that the panel needs to grapple with in terms of the strategic location question is whether they should support more lifestyle blocks around the existing urban settlements, which I think is more beneficial, or whether a more hands-off approach is taken as currently proposed in the district plan, in my view, in which case the implication will be that all of the 5 and 10 and 15 hectare blocks that sit right in the middle of the rural area, halfway between Auckland and Hamilton and out to the west coast, will become more and more sought after, and people will start taking up those lots. And at that point, you run into one of the main issues, which is that instead of someone taking 5,000 square metres or 10,000 square metres next to an existing town, they're taking 10 or 15 or 20 hectares, which they might pick up for $500,000. And that takes a much bigger piece of land out of the rural productive sector, which is really a significant cost. And for that reason, this policy question is very much a numbers game. It's not something that you can grapple with in terms of planning theory or land use theory. It's very much a matter of getting an Excel spreadsheet out and looking at what the implications are. It's very much a numbers question.
Thank you. I really appreciate your take on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb.
No, I've got no questions, but I do appreciate that conversation, Mr. Thompson. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, Mr. Thompson, under your estimates, there's under the proposed plan, there is available at the moment 2,170 country living titles available. Is that's in your chart, isn't it? Figure 1 of your rebuttal.
That's approximately correct, yes.
Yeah, and I think you've said that there's 210 dwellings per annum consented. That seems to be what the records show. So under that scenario, if that continued, there would be sufficient capacity over the next 10 years, wouldn't there?
So that's the existing lots. In terms of the additional lifestyle blocks that can be created, there's capacity for another 7,800. So that's where I get my estimate of 10,500 or so. And I suggest it's worth checking that against Dr. Fairgray's estimates, who has done some research for the council, of 8,500. So really you have a lot more than 10 years. You have 40 to 50 years, with my estimate being 50 and the council's experts estimate being 40 years of supply. So it's a fairly large amount of supply. That's why I say it's not so much a question of whether the demand for 210 lots per annum should be met or not, because that supply will meet that demand. The question really becomes the location of that supply that meets demand, and whether there's any way to improve the social and economic outcomes.
So there's sufficient
how that supplies.
What you're saying for this sort of type of lifestyle, there's sufficient capacity there at the moment, but there's a lack of choice. Is that really?
Well, in terms of quantity, there's a sufficient capacity. There's 40 to 50 years, so there's many times over how much capacity is actually required to meet demand. And the question is therefore what the best location for that demand is in terms of the.
Okay.
In terms. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of background noise there.
Yeah.
So the question is what the best location is for that demand to be met, in my view, and also the type of lifestyle block that's provided to the market. And obviously with mechanisms such as TDRs, you can add some additional environmental and ecosystem services benefits into the equation at no real public cost. So my view, it's an opportunity to manage lifestyle block development for some quite easily achieved social and economic benefits.
So it's really the appropriate location that you're saying, and so you could get people in Tamahiri saying, well, we want more country living down this way too. So it's because it's a good location for that. So there's some competing tensions here, isn't there?
There are, and the way that breaks down from a technical perspective is this: if you have 5,000 square metres in the Buckland area, for example, that will be more sought after than 5 hectares 30 minutes south and 10 hectares 45 minutes southwest. So you're essentially able to say to a purchaser of a lifestyle block moving into the district, you can take this option in Buckland of 5,000 square metres, which meets your needs, or you can take a 10 hectare rural property, out from Huntly, for example, and they will value those equivalently if one has slightly more land than the other, in the same way that a purchaser would prefer a larger suburban house on the edge of Auckland compared to a smaller suburban house in a middle suburb in Auckland.
How much capacity did the Auckland Unitary Plan provide, just off the top of your head, in terms of country living?
I can't recall the exact numbers, I'm sorry, but there's a fairly large supply within the Auckland area that can potentially be developed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one question from me, Mr. Thompson. Have you, you've set out the economic benefits of the proposal as it's been put to you. Have you evaluated any counterfactuals whereby you've compared the economic value of other opportunities? And the one I'm particularly thinking of might be the amalgamation of titles to make the land that's currently not able to be used productively, able to be used productively.
It's not something I haven't got into that much detail for my assessment for this submission. I certainly think those sorts of things are worth looking at, but generally speaking, the TDR mechanism is a an effective way of achieving those sorts of outcomes. At the moment, to get a transferable development right will cost you $150,000 to $200,000. So what you're essentially doing is giving the current landowner that amount of money to do some native revegetation and fencing and so forth, and obviously incentivize them to do that, and thereby you get that public benefit of that revegetation for no public sector cost, which is obviously the big hurdle, because you're in the hundreds of millions to do the revegetation that would benefit the district's agricultural land and production. But yeah, back to your question, I think there may be some scope to look at some more refined mechanisms to achieve these outcomes, but I haven't looked at that.
All right, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thanks for your evidence, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel, and thank you, Adam. Now we'll move on to Mr. Forrester for surveying perspective. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, thank you very much, panel and Mr. Chairman. I think probably the first thing I'd like to do is just paint a bit of a picture for you of the Buckland area and the merging of the Auckland and Waikato areas. The length of the boundary between...
Excuse me, can we have a Google map up just to help follow you? We can probably put one up.
I'm not sure if I'm technically capable of doing that, but
no, I just think
I'll give it a go.
I think Mr. Bell will be able to help you out.
Yeah.
This was just in relation to the Buckland area, or was there some...
Fletcher, if you can put up a Google map that shows us the span of the boundary between Auckland and Waikato. So put Buckland in the middle and zoom out until we can see the Tasman coast on the west and the Firth of Thames in the east. That's the one.
Can everyone see that?
Can you zoom out a little further so we can see the Firth of Thames? Okay. That's it. Okay. Good stuff. So the length of the boundary line between Auckland and Waikato is about 80 kilometres if you follow it from the west coast to the Firth of Thames. The stretch of boundary line that runs right through the middle of Buckland is only 2.5 kilometres long. So we've got almost 80 kilometres of boundary line where you have rural land touching rural land, and 2.5 kilometres of boundary line where you have highly intensive residential land in Auckland Council in Buckland touching onto rural land in Buckland. And that's quite an important point I'd like to make. Can you zoom into the Buckland area, please, Fletcher? That's the one. So where the word Buckland is in the screen that we're looking at the moment, all of the land to the right of Buckland, the word Buckland, and up to the north of that where the word Auckland is written on that road, all of that land is in the future urban zone, and it's going to be rezoned to residential land with minimum lot sizes of 400 square metres. And straight over the road, we've got Waikato District rural land. And there doesn't seem to have been any thought given to some kind of a transition between those massively different land uses. And that's one of the points in the submission that we've made that I'd like to try and get addressed. Our preference is to try and have some countryside living over here, because the average lot size in the Buckland area in our 450 hectares that we've drawn up is only 3.5 hectares. And that's happened over years and years of subdivision that we've resulted with this. So the horse is bolted. We've got lifestyle blocks in this area now, and that's the nature of the beast we're dealing with. To try and think that this land is going to be used for some productive rural use is just a farce, really. It isn't going to happen. The largest property in the Buckland area is only 14 hectares. We'd like to have some countryside living zone in this particular area. At the moment, that allows subdivision down to 5,000 square metres in the proposed Waikato district plan. This, from the middle of our Buckland area to the very centre of Pukekohe Township that you can see in that plan we're looking at, is only 4 kilometres. In the middle of Pukekohe, we've got a lot of schools and several supermarkets and all the healthcare facilities that people need when they live out in the country to get to. So the Buckland area is very close to those facilities. The proposed Waikato district plan promotes rural subdivision opportunities. One of those is called a general lot, and that is able to be achieved just as of right. You can subdivide a lifestyle block off your farm, provided it meets certain area and age requirements, and that has absolutely no environmental benefit whatsoever. There are opportunities to create subdivisions through environmental protection and revegetation, which is fantastic, and I champion that. But the problem that we've got is that a lot of the properties that these sorts of subdivisions are going to happen on are located way out in the country, a long way from all of the important services that the people need, schools, shopping and healthcare. So they're going to be very heavily reliant on their car to get backwards and forwards every day from where they live. What we'd like to see is an ability for those development rights to be relocated to somewhere more appropriate. And we're promoting the idea of Buckland being a transferable development right receiver area because it has such unique characteristics of being that close to the town of Pukekohe and that close to all of the important infrastructure that people need. Auckland Council, as you know, has incorporated the Cabra decision into the Auckland Unitary Plan, and this allows for the transfer of development rights from rural properties, large rural production properties, into a countryside living zone, which is essentially what we're asking you to allow us to do here. That champions the idea of rural native vegetation protection and revegetation, which is a great result for us to achieve. Another thing I'd probably point out to that I just thought of while I was listening to Mr. Thompson's evidence is whilst Auckland Council does have a large countryside living zone area that is able to provide for these lifestyle opportunities, it's predominantly located on the North Shore in the Dairy Flat area. There's very, very little allowance made in the Auckland Unitary Plan for any lifestyle blocks on the south side of town. But the Drury area is growing at a rate of knots at the moment with new business zones, and all of the people working in these areas are going to want to live as close to work as they can. But a big percentage of them may want to live on a lifestyle block, and they're not going to live on the North Shore. They're going to want to live South Auckland way. So there will be some pressure coming on the northern Waikato area to provide those lifestyle blocks. And you know, as has been pointed out, if there isn't an opportunity to purchase a lifestyle block, people are just going to go out and buy existing rural properties that, you know, will take them out of production. So this is something that, you know, I'm extremely championing, because I've been working in this area of subdivision for a long time now, and I've seen how well transferable development rights can actually work. The problem we've got is they haven't been well managed in the Waikato district plan up to now, but Auckland Council has got it right. They've gone and made some tweaking changes to the way that those rules are being applied, and they've got a lot more control over where the development rights are sent to, which was lacking in the Waikato district plan Franklin section. There was very little control over where they could go. I'd like to propose that if we can get the Buckland area as a receiver area for transferable titles, we'll have a lot of control, and we'll also end up seeing a lot of environmental protection out in the countryside, which gets us, you know, the results that we'd like to see. All of the streams and rivers being planted up, like on Mr. McCown's properties, and the native bush being protected. So yeah, I think that's where I'd like to close it off.
All right, thanks, Mr. Forrester. We'll see if there's any questions for you. Could we start with you, Mr. Marg, please?
Yeah, just one, Mr. Forrester, and listening to you, everything you said made sense to a degree, but to me. But would you say the option, if we were to choose, is going to reduce any unplanned fragmentation of farms?
I think it would give us an option. So farmers would either choose to subdivide their farms and create a lifestyle block on it if they felt like there was a desire for that to happen. But if there wasn't, because their farm was a long way from the nearest town, they may choose to still do the conservation of the bush or the planting of the streams on their farms, but sell that right as a transferable development right instead. And we're going to, you know, a lot of the farmers are now facing pressure coming on them because of healthy waters legislation that the government's pushing through, requiring them to fence off all of the streams through their properties and plant them up. If we can give them an option to be able to do that work, but then get a financial reward for it by being able to sell the transferable development right, we're basically giving everyone a win. We're getting our waterways planted, we're giving the farmers a way of paying for them to be planted up, and then that development right is ultimately going to be transferred to a more appropriate location like Buckland rather than being used at Limestone Downs. And I'm just making up a place now because I've done a lot of bush conservation out at Limestone Downs. It's a place that's 120 kilometres round trip to fill your tank of petrol. You just don't want lifestyle blocks being, you know, located that far from town.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
Just a thought in terms, when we looked at that aerial view, very close to the Tuakau racetrack, correct?
Correct.
So I'm aware that there's a noise overlay. How would you, and this may not be a question for you, so if somebody else wishes to answer it, how would you expect that the sensitivity from that noise, would that be an issue?
Auckland Council have obviously taken this on board themselves because the gap between the boundary line that we can see in that diagram at the moment and the racetrack is going to be covered in houses and businesses. They've got a combination of residential zoning and business zoning that they've applied to all of that land. So the noise is going to have to go through all of those houses and businesses before it reaches the Buckland area.
Okay.
I'd say that the racetrack themselves have probably got a bit of pressure on them to bring their noise under control. But they must have some existing use rights as well.
You'd imagine. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
No questions, but I found your evidence very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yes, Mr. Forrester, the transferable titles were in the Franklin section of the Waikato District Plan and not in the Waikato's plan. And the transferable titles crossing the boundary from Auckland has been stopped.
Yeah.
So in effect, where would the transferable titles come from unless the Waikato plan allowed for transferable titles within the Waikato? You're not going to be able to shift them from Auckland back down to that site. So what you're effectively saying is Waikato District Plan needs to have transferable titles available to it. Is that right?
Correct. I'd like to see,
had some of that debate.
Yeah, I'd like to see any of the subdivision opportunities available in the Waikato District Plan to rural properties being able to either be used in situ on the property, or you can elect to actually turn them into a transferable development right and send them somewhere else. And we're just promoting the somewhere else is Buckland as a starting point. And let's give it a trial run and see how it goes, because it's a very small area. I mean, we were talking about, you know, is Buckland a big area or not? 450 hectares, you know, in the sense of the entire Waikato district is just a drop in the bucket. I'd like to see it treated as a trial run and we can encourage all of the environmental protection to happen across the entire Waikato district, and perhaps you know, a percentage of the people that do that will elect to actually transfer them as transferable development rights instead of actually creating them on their own properties. And that'll probably come down to A, whether the farmer really wants to have a new lifestyle block neighbour, and B, is it going to be a saleable commodity at the end of the day? If it isn't, they'll still get some benefit of doing that environmental protection and selling it as a transferable development right. But it can come from anywhere in the Waikato district. But definitely not from Auckland Council and into Waikato. This is a Waikato District Council rule that we're promoting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thanks, Mr. Forrester.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Forrester. That's pretty clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forrester. And I think we're changing seats. And now Ms. Nairn is in the hot seat, so she's going to address the planning evidence that she's presented. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, panel, for the opportunity to speak. Part of the problem with being a planner is that sometimes everybody else says what you want to say. So I don't want to repeat a whole lot of things. I'm going to try and just touch on a few key points. And the points really relate to the current context of the land, the future context of the land, and how our relief would fit in with that future context. So when you look at the current context of the land, as we've heard Mr. Brown say this morning, this land is close to Tuakau. You know, people go there for their shopping, their kids go to school there, they may work there. So it's in a really appealing location, this land. The second factor, when it comes to context, is the fragmentation of the land. And when I picked up this work and started looking into it, you know, the comment was, well, it's fragmented land. And I thought, well, look, how does that really work? How much fragmentation is fragmentation? And what I did was I compared the cadastral layout from the 1987 Franklin planning scheme with our current cadastral layout. And what I found was that there was 35 odd lots in 1987, and now there's more than 100 within this Buckland landowner group area. And what that equates to is 2 to 3 subdivisions per year, every year for 30 years. So having looked at that, I was able to conclude, look, this land is fragmented, and it's highly fragmented. The third factor when looking at the context is looking at the type of activities that are happening here on this land. And when you look at it, you can see things like there's a little racetrack, there's large houses on large lots, there's people that keep a few animals, and there's a lot of people that work in the rural support type of sector. And what that means is that this area is peri-urban. It's not entirely urban, and it's not entirely rural. It's land on the edge, and it's used as such. And I think that is a key characteristic, and we need to take that on board. Because collectively, when you add up the great context, the fragmentation of the land, and the activities that are happening, it's telling me that in a planning sense that this land is creating a transition between the urban area and the rural area. What it's also telling me is that the rural zone that's applied in the proposed plan isn't entirely suitable. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but the objective of the rural zone is to enable farming, and that's not an activity that's happening there at the moment. So the first conclusion that I've come to is that this land doesn't inherently fit with the proposed rural zone. So the next question comes, well, what does fit? And to work out what does fit, you have to look at the future context. And my colleague Craig has just talked around how on the other side of Golding and Logan Roads, the Auckland Council's proposed mixed housing suburban zoning. And what that will do is create lots down to 4,000 square metres. Oh, sorry, 400 square metres. And so you'll have lots of 400 square metres on one side of the road and lots with an average of 3.5 hectares on the other. So how do we best manage that transition, and how do we make it work? Well, the regional policy statement tells us we need to manage it. It tells us we need to turn our minds to it. And in my view, if we applied either the country living zone or a transferable title development area, it would help us achieve integrated development across that boundary between the two districts. Because under both of those options, you'd see a more intensive level of development. It would be in an area where people want it. It would meet demand for country living, but yet it would still allow that transitional function to occur. I see that this approach is similar to what the consultant planner on behalf of councils promoted for Havelock Village. It's in that situation, the countryside living was performing creating a southern edge to that development, and I think that this could do the same, bearing in mind that Auckland Council's provided for the growth, and it's up to the Waikato to manage the edge. And I see if we put this in place, it would create integrated development that manages that boundary. I think that's all I've got to say.
All right, thanks, Ms. Nairn. Mr. Fulton, any questions from you?
No, thank you very much. No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, Ms. Nairn. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No questions from me, but Ms. Nairn, I always find your reports very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, just listening to the evidence, you mentioned about the intensive development on the border across the road in the Auckland area, and when you compare that with what's here now, you've got, and I think various witnesses have described it as really a country living area at the moment. It's 3.5 hectares, so we don't have farms.
Agree.
So there's already a transition area there, isn't there? Why the need to change it? If you want to put that argument to, turning it round.
Yes, no, I understand that, and it's something that we've thought about, but I think that transition area is there, but why not make better use of it? Why not enable a more efficient transition area than what is currently happening? And so, you're looking at it going from 3.5 hectare lots. If you brought that down to 5,000 square metres under the country living zone, you've got a more intensive use, but still providing that transitional function, on top of the fact that you're meeting demand for country living type land. And it's already compromised land. So there's no lose, there's no, we're taking away productive land.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nairn. I don't think I have any questions either, thanks. I think the evidence is clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And that's essentially the case for the rezoning and the TDR mechanisms and or the country living zone for Buckland. Just thinking a little bit and reflecting on the questions from Commissioner Cooney about what's been happening in Auckland, I suppose maybe to reframe it and put it in a more positive light. It's a massive exercise, this planning, district plan change of this scale and on a massive district like the Waikato. And I suppose just to encourage the panel to consider what could be learned from what's been happening in Auckland in terms of these mechanisms, and see if there's anything that's relevant. We suggest it is, but certainly there's a lot of hard work has been done. And rather than reinvent the wheel, I suppose that's the positive way to consider what's been happening in Auckland. It's not binding, but it is an example that has been working from our perspective, based on the evidence and has been tested in the court. So there is a bit of a template there that could be of assistance to the panel. But otherwise, I think this is probably the last maybe time you'll hear from Middlemiss and Buckland. It's been quite a journey with COVID, etc. And we'd just like to, on behalf of the team, thank the panel and wish you all the best for the deliberations for the final determinations.
Yeah, Mr. Fuller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fuller.
Thank you.
We're a little bit ahead of schedule. Is Kirrimore Trust, I'm not sure if that's Mr. Oliver who's leading the charge there or somebody else. Are you ready to make a start, Mr. Oliver?
Yes, we're very close. I've got people on standby and just having a look to see who's there at the moment. I think most of our team are there. It might just take 5 minutes just to get the last couple of stragglers, but we're certainly very close.
Do they all need to be there before you make a start, or can you make a start and backfill them as it were?
Yes, we can probably make a start. We've got Jonathan Brookhausen first, and I see he's there.
All right. Well, if you're happy to do that, let's make a start, and we'll break it at about 3:15 as planned, but we'll find a convenient place depending on how things are going.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and commissioners. So yes, just to reinforce this, this submission is submission number 182 by Kirrimore Trustee Limited. It is for rezoning of land on Geraghty's Road, as you've heard discussed previously by some other witnesses, including Denise Tansley. So I've got statements of evidence from several witnesses, and we'll work our way through those. They will keep their statements brief, summarising their summaries, I think is the plan. And we'll make a start with Jonathan Brookhausen, Urban Design.
Very good, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Brookhausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Commissioners. I will keep my, I'll take my evidence as read, and I'll keep my summary, as John put it, relatively brief. From an urban design perspective, the proposal and submissions from other submitters is relatively straightforward. There are no outstanding points of disagreement. There's general collective agreement that in terms of a contextual fit, the rezoning of the landholding is a good contextual fit, rezoning it as residential. There are obviously other outstanding issues, primarily around infrastructure, is my understanding. The land in question would see 38 hectares. Let me just recall my numbers here. 38 hectares rezoned as residential. This rezoning is estimated to result in a yield somewhere around 425 additional lots, obviously on the southwestern side of existing Tuakau. This land is in close proximity to the amenities of the Tuakau township, including the town centre and local schools. It's able to connect into the proposed framework that the Tuakau structure plan provides, and the proposed structure plan drawing that was included in my evidence shows how that would work. I might actually just share my screen if that's possible, or is it easier if somebody else pulls up the structure plan?
I can do. I've got it here if that would help.
That would be great. Thank you.
Except I've been disabled. I'm sure that can be rectified.
You should have access now, sorry.
You got it now, thank you.
So it's just appended to my evidence, but I'm sure you know where it is. Yep, there we go. So I'll just quickly talk the panel through this structure plan, although it's probably pretty self-explanatory. I won't take much time. The proposal is obviously the area that's contained within the thick black line. We're just on the western side of Geraghty's Road. Geraghty's Road is obviously an existing public road. It's well formed and connects up through to existing Tuakau. That just where the cursor is, there's a solid black line there. That's a proposed road in the Tuakau structure plan. Yep, that one there, coming off Geraghty's Road and forming a four-way intersection with St. John's Avenue. The dashed line that's obviously running through our site and further north connects through to that road and then through to Geraghty's Road, and that's seen as the kind of primary road running through the structure plan area. There's a couple of loops off of that road just to sort of show that there is some larger bits of proposed residential land which would require a bit more access via road. There's a existing sort of gully with some standing ponds running through the centre of the site, which is forming a bit of an open space framework and including a larger sort of swampy area that's got a label on it there, existing vegetation / wetland to the western side of our site. So that's sort of starting to set up a bit of a open space framework, and that also offers opportunities for a walking and cycling path, which is shown by the dashed orange line, to connect to the solid orange line, which is a walking and cycling path as shown in the Tuakau structure plan. So pretty intuitive and obvious moves on this one. There's a pretty robust framework and pretty easy to just be plugging into the existing, well, to the residential area to the east, noting that that's quite a historic subdivision layout that's shown there, and then obviously plugging in to the proposed rezoning as part of the Tuakau structure plan. You'll see the sort of where it says proposed residential zone, just to the north of the gully, there's a bit of the GVAN block that's not included. The reason for that is that land was proposed as residential zone in the PDP. It's my understanding that Ms. Trenouth's recommendation is that land and our land is rather included as future urban. So just to cover off the fact that piece of land could easily be included in the Geraghty's structure plan, and we're obviously still seeking a live zoning. The only other thing to note is just a dashed green line along the southern boundary, which is some screen planting. There's obviously some existing industrial uses, the EnviroFit facility to the south of our site, which we just want to make sure that and the existing rural land to the south, that we are sort of screening one from the other. Other than that, pretty straightforward. It's quite a simple fit in terms of an urban design considerations. But I'm happy to answer any questions that the panel may have.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Brookhausen. We'll see if there are any questions for you. Can we start with you this time, Ms. Tuakau, please?
No, I don't think I've got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Could you show me on the plan where the regional council drainage area is, please?
Do you want me to put that back up?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, yeah.
I'm not overly familiar with where that is. Is that not the sort of protected vegetation on the western side there?
I'm just wondering, and maybe you're not the person to ask.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not familiar with where that is.
Right. No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a question on the existing vegetation and wetlands to the west. It's quite a big area. How compatible is that with the development? Is it a native vegetation, or is it willows and whatever?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix, but there's it looks like it's pretty old growth. It's pretty swampy land. So it's obviously never been farmed before because it was swampy back in the day. And then I may be wrong, but I'm relatively certain it is protected as it currently stands. I think it's compatible. You know, it would not be proposed to be developed as part of this development. There's often benefits that can be done in terms of water quality when you retire farmland and meet sort of current water standards and develop it for residential land use. There's obviously amenity that comes with that existing vegetation for the residential people that move in here. So yeah, no issues from a compatibility standpoint from my end.
So the SNA areas, are they?
Testing my knowledge, I'm not sure. I might have to refer to Mr. Oliver on that.
Someone else might answer that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I could just answer that now while you've got the plan up there, Commissioner, if that's all right. So that existing vegetation wetland area, Jonathan is correct in saying it is quite old growth and quite a lot of natives and things in there. But one of the things not shown on here is there's quite a big level difference between the site and the wetland area, which is probably 10, 15 meters below it. So the land to the west there is part of the Waikato River floodplain, and it kind of extends into the lower land there. Then you've got a steep escarpment, which is vegetated, and then you've got the flat land on top. And there's around about, I think, about 10 hectares in that area identified on there, and about 2 hectares of that is protected under a conservation covenant that's registered on the title, but the balance is not protected in terms of anything on the title.
Well, thank you for that.
Mr. Cooney.
While you're there, Mr. Oliver, who's the best person to ask about the soil type?
Probably me.
Okay. Well, I may as well ask it now. What is the soil? Is it high class soil or productive land or what?
Right, so it's the flat land is quite similar to other land around this southwestern part of Tuakau. So it is classes 1 and 2 on the flat land, which is obviously highly productive soils. But I think, as you can see from this drawing and also from the cadastral information below it, it is broken up into quite small blocks. In this case, there are 3 of those landowners are 10 hectares to 15 hectares kind of size, and the other 3 are much smaller. Miss Tansley's a hectare, and the other one's, I think, 2 hectares and another hectare down in the corner. So it is quite fragmented, and also the gully system, as you can see in this, does break it up quite significantly as well. So it is, yes, the flat land is good productive soils, but it is fragmented.
Okay, thank you.
And I was going to ask the same question. Just to clarify though, that, if I might call it the northernmost of the 3 areas or 3 property titles that make up the area, in other words, this one through here, is that still currently cropped? Looks from Google Maps and this overlay as well that's what's there at the moment. Is that still the case?
The last time I was there, I believe it was under maize actually. So, but that is some time ago. But
okay,
it was. I'm pretty sure it was maize at that time.
All right, very good. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brookhausen.
Thank you.
So next up is Andrew Curtis. Oh, sorry, no, I'll go Kelvin Norgrove first. Thanks, Kelvin.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon. Hang on, let me just get rid of this.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Gone.
Okay, my evidence is focused on the capacity issues and the particularly in the medium term for Tuakau. And rather than go through the numbers in any detail, I'll just note that there's obviously been quite a lot of toing and froing over the last few years on the capacity and demand picture for Tuakau. And we've had the original Section 32 report, and there's housing and business assessments, culminating more recently in the Section 42A, the framework report, and subsequent extracts of analysis that have been posted by the council. And the bottom line is that we've finally arrived at a conclusion that greater capacity is needed in Tuakau than is provided for in the proposed district plan. Despite the Section 42A report recommending additional land be live zoned, the recommendations around future urban zone application do not resolve that fundamental problem that there is a deficit on the table now in providing for what is actually medium growth scenarios right through the reporting rather than a high growth scenario. And I believe, as I've set out in my evidence in chief, that a high growth scenario is appropriate for Tuakau, bearing in mind its recent growth trends and also what's happening in terms of Auckland spillover patterns at the moment. The introductory statement I read this morning from Chloe Trenoof does provide a figure of current population of 7,622 in Tuakau, whereas I was previously referring to 6,600. So I think that high growth scenario does need to be kept in mind because most of the commentary is anchored in a medium scenario. So the main sort of concern I have is in the Section 42A report is that provision for 425 dwellings in Tuakau in the Geraghties Road site is included in Table 6 in the 42A report as happening during 2023 to 2030. And that leads to the conclusion that there is not really much of a problem in terms of capacity. But if it was consistent with the recommendation that it be future urban zone, then it couldn't be in that next 2023-30 period. So there would be a shortfall of 160 dwellings. And that's on top of a shortfall of 730 in the next few years. And those are all figures from the Section 42A report. And in the statement this morning I read from Ms. Trenoof, there is a reference to that 730 being a larger supply, but I think it meant to say a supply issue because it's actually a shortfall. But nonetheless, that's still consistent with the previous commentary. So the real point is that in order to achieve that capacity at Geraghties Road, it needs to be live zoned rather than subject to a future plan change. And the issue around the long-term plan, the council's long-term plan for funding of infrastructure and attaching infrastructure investment to the towns, I think is entirely reasonable to expect the next LTP process, which will likely commence in 2023, to address not only Geraghties Road, but also any other blocks of land that, as a result of your decisions or recommendations on the proposed plan, actually change the landscape going into the next long-term plan compared to the current one that has been adopted by the council and based on the proposed district plan as it was notified. So there's a catch-up process that's inevitable with long-term plans. And that is all in good order in my mind, that it's appropriate that the next LTP pick up from the decisions on the proposed district plan, which will change things that are currently live zoned in the proposed district plan, maybe future urban zone. And obviously some other sites such as what we're proposing here would also be brought into that equation. So those are my two key messages really, that we've got to bear in mind the high growth scenario, which is at the top end of previous work for the Section 32 report and also from the housing and business assessments. And that hasn't been brought through into the Section 42A reports. They're anchored on the medium projection. And I'd just finish off by saying in the statement this morning, para 15, it refers to the short-term supply issue, but the conclusion that the most recent report from Dr. Davey shows there's sufficient capacity once you allow for what's expected to be realised. So that was in para 59 of Ms. Trenuth's statement this morning. Those figures in that most recent report only go to 2036. So it's a different time horizon than was used previously in the reports, which unfortunately adds a bit of confusion. But the point is that assessment to 2036, not only is it based on a medium scenario, but it doesn't reflect that medium term in the MPS. The long term to 2050 is not reflected in that result. And I also suggest that the supply figures in there still count Geraghty's Road in the 2023 to 30 time horizon. So there's mixed messages going on and they need to be resolved. And I think it's entirely consistent that a live zoning be applied to this land in order to meet the MPS requirements. I'll finish there and happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks very much, Mr. Norgrove. Can we start with you this time, Ms. Gibb, please?
Sorry, I keep flicking off. No questions, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sedgwick.
Apologies. No, I have no questions, but I did note your comment on the long-term plan relation to what you're doing. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
Nothing from me, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Yes, it's just, I don't know whether you are the person to comment on this, but in the report, it says Watercare advised the council that 3 water infrastructure is not suitably planned for this area subject to the site because it wasn't in the Waikato 2070 plan. Isn't that just a matter of saying, well, okay, if this one goes ahead, it's only a matter of switching from one area to another to satisfy a live zoning of your property or of your development there? Is that the way you see it?
That's the way I see it, yes. The Watercare will inevitably want to look at decisions made through this proposed district plan process, which I think have more weight and currency than 2070, than the long-term strategy. And in planning ahead for servicing these towns, they will definitely need to return to what decisions are made in this process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Did I ask you, Mr. Marg? I'm not sure if I did.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I did. Mr. Cooney, please.
Yes, the NPSUD does not require us to provide sufficient capacity in each town within the Waikato, does it?
No, it's not that prescriptive.
No. Okay, thank you. You say this is a high demand area. Mr. Tremuth says that it hasn't had the much uptake in terms of demand. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I was a bit perplexed by that. I know the area well, and I do quite a lot of work in the northern Waikato, so I've obviously seen what's happening in Pokeno. When I look at the figures in Tuakau, there was a comment that there's only been 100 building consents issued for new dwellings since 2018, I think. And yet the population is estimated as having gone from 6,500 to 7,300 or so. which suggests household size has got larger. So there's, young families moving in. So you've got higher occupancy of existing houses, I would say, if those consent figures are accurate for any new houses. But there will have been houses built certainly over the 2010 to 18 period that were probably not occupied for, or recorded as part of the census. And then there's been analysis to show that there's several thousand ex-Aucklanders that have moved in to that northern Waikato area. And of course, some of them are in Pocono, but I believe some of them are in Tuakau. And that scenario, in the last projections prepared for the council, reflects an expectation that migration from Auckland will definitely continue on the back of affordable housing issues. And the Waikato doesn't actually depend on international migration. So Auckland itself is facing lower growth or slower growth because of that short-term or possibly short-term removal of international migrants. But the Waikato has for a while been attracting people from Auckland, and there's no reason to expect that to change just because international migration has stopped. And in fact, less people are leaving Auckland and Waikato to go overseas to Australia and so on. So that'll all play out, and it may be regarded as a short-term situation. But the fact is that the northern Waikato has sustained relatively high growth for some time now.
Thank you.
I've just got one question, Mr. Norgrove, and it's similar to the one I asked Mr. Thompson earlier that you may have heard. You've focused your evidence on fulfilling the needs of the community, if you like, for residentially zoned land. Have you looked at any counterfactuals in terms of whether it's an NPV, or I don't know how you'd measure it, but between that and ongoing productive use as high quality soil?
I certainly looked at that from the point of view of this location, and I was aware that there were several blocks of horticultural land being sold a couple of years ago now in the vicinity. And on my conversations with growers, having interviewed several of them over recent years, there's obviously pressure when sites are this close to town. And my understanding is, having been to this site and the surrounding area, they're not large horticultural sites. Not much of it other than the Jivan block is in productive use. At the moment, they're lifestyle properties. And I think they're relatively fragmented and unlikely to return to intensive growing activity. So residential or even commercial use is a higher value use of this land. From a purely cost benefit point of view, it would be a superior use. The option values of keeping it for rural production are relevant in terms of the policy environment of the plan, or the objectives and policies of the plan. But this is such a relatively small area compared to the wider volume of productive rural land that is still protected in the proposed plan and in other areas, not far away from Tuakau.
Right, no, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I have no further questions. Thanks, Mr. Norgrove.
Just one question from that, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
If we rezone this land urban, it creates a precedent for the block above, doesn't it? For the Buckland Road block as well.
when I was looking at Waikato 2070, it obviously there's a huge block of land there at Bucklands and hasn't got the road connections. It's not got readily available infrastructure, and it obviously merges into Buckland up the road. And I thought that was a weaker candidate for zoning and taking out of rural production, given the scale of activities currently operating on some of that land, compared to the Geraghties Road site, which is already zoned on the other side of the road and has that defensive boundary on the west in terms of the natural features. So I didn't see it being a catalyst for Buckland. I saw that really requiring a more comprehensive planning approach to actually sort of bring the town west and essentially start filling in between Tuakau and almost Pukekohe.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Norgrove.
Thank you.
Right, the next witness is Andrew Curtis.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
I think I've got a couple of very brief comments. My evidence, as you've read it, obviously relate to the issue of reverse sensitivity, and Mr. Nuth this morning made a comment that in relation to this site, that she felt that the reverse sensitivity effects could be managed, and I would agree with that. And I think my view on this was further strengthened in the presentation this morning when you heard from Tuakau Protein, where they talked about the fact that they've been granted a relatively short-term consent, which essentially requires them, I think the words used were fully contain their emissions. I suspect what that meant was that they're going to have to rebuild their plant and put it under negative pressure, and have all the discharges from the main rendering building treated through some form of treatment device. So yeah, I think that from my point of view, the fact that I guess there is no specific definition of reverse sensitivity in the proposed plan is unfortunate, but I think there are existing ones which are fine. I think that if plants are operating within the confines of their resource consent, in this case particularly EnviroFert and Tuakau Proteins, then there is no potential for air quality related reverse sensitivity effects, and that really only occurs when you start to move outside the permitted activity or the consent conditions you're operating. And I'll might leave it there because I'm going to talk to you a bit more about that on Thursday morning. So yeah, I think from an equality point of view, this site is fine. I think in many ways it's consistent with the the district council's proposal with that Buckland land that you were just talking about, because the Pukekohe wastewater treatment plant is relatively close to that land, and with the 300 metre separation distance that was required there, we have more than that here for Geraghties between both the Tuakau Proteins and EnviroFert.
All right, thank you, Mr. Curtis. We'll see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me. Thank you, Mr. Curtis.
Mr. Fulton?
No, thank you, Mr. Curtis. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
Nothing, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Nothing from me. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Curtis.
Okay, the next witness is Mr. Balachandran, Transport Engineer.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. hope I'm clear. You can hear me?
Yes, you are perfectly. Thank you.
Hey,
Well, we can hear you clearly. We'll see how clear you are in a moment, but we can hear you clearly.
Yep. So I believe you've read my written statement. So I'll
Yes,
just
we
keep
have.
it
Thank
very
you.
brief. So I've actually undertaken a high-level assessment on the traffic and transportation effects of the additional traffic that this site is going to generate on the adjoining road network. So following my rebuttal evidence, Ms. Trinoth did not identify any additional or potential actual transportation issues that need to be addressed. So in summary, the proposed site, once fully developed with approximately 425 dwellings, is likely to generate approximately 470 vehicle movements and about 3,600 vehicles per day. My assessment finds that the overall transportation effects of the proposed rezoning on the adjoining road network are likely to be minor to moderate due to the limited roading infrastructure that currently exists. However, I've recommended a few infrastructure upgrades in my written statements, which include corridor upgrades for Garrigatis Road and St. John's Avenue. And there's also intersection upgrades, which were basically assessed from a safe system risk assessment perspective. And from a capacity perspective, it did not need any upgrades. So development of the site will only contribute to like a small proportion of the overall traffic generated by all the other large zoned sites in Tuakau. This includes the Drumgoose and Buckland Road areas. So I consider that the cumulative transport effects of all the zoned but substantially undeveloped land is likely to generate the need for safety upgrades to the intersections, regardless of whether this proposed KTL site is being rezoned. However, given the lack of information that we have of all the other sites, what I've recommended is that this intersection upgrades and corridor upgrades should be considered in greater detail at the time of respective resource consent applications by either KTL or the other land developers. Yep, thank you, and I'm ready to answer questions.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Balachandran. Ms. Tiaho?
No questions on transport for me, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thanks.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Yes, I see that the section 42A also suggests that there may be issues and constraints on the transport network because this is not liable for development contributions because it's not in the long-term plan. Is there a plan B from your perspective as to how that would be managed, or is that a full stop on the concept?
I think with regards to his development contributions, and so I think Mr. Oliver will be the best to answer those questions.
Okay, so as it impacts on transport.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No comment, but thank you for your update and yeah, cumulative effects. Obviously, economies of scale, it might be development contributions all round, but we'll just see what happens. Thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Just a question on closest to primary schools and the secondary school, Tuakau College. This area developed would just about be within walking distance of children, would it, to those schools?
Yes, it would be. So we
Could
have
you
actually
estimate be
sorry.
within 800 meters? Is this the level? I'm just trying to picture
Yeah, so
it myself.
the schools are within 800 meters. I think the nearest bus stop itself, which is along George Street, that's further
Yeah.
away from the school, that's 800 meters. So the schools are actually slightly closer.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
And I have no questions either. Thanks, Mr. Balachandran. Thanks for your evidence.
Thank you, Commissioners.
I think we'll take our afternoon adjournment now and we'll resume again at 3:35. Thank you.
I'll take that my evidence and summary are being read, and there's no concerns being raised in the section 42 report in terms of stormwater. And I might just quickly summarize two things that I have focused on. First is stormwater management, which is based on the WRC guidelines TR 2018-01, which is about managing water quality, erosion, and scour issues. And that's been proposed to be managed with treatment train approach. And this includes at source and communal devices. And the second aspect is flood management. So there's been flood studies being done by Waikato Regional Council for River Waikato, and there's structure planning work, which included flood modeling that has looked at the flood plains within for any pluvial flooding. And one of the concerns that around floodplains have been addressed by designating open spaces wherever there are floodplains. So there's no proposed development going within those floodplains. And there's a question raised in terms of the drains. Am I able to share my screen? I can quickly show where those are.
Sure, thank you.
So the structure plan area we're looking at sits here, and there's a drain, Waikato Regional Council land drainage scheme, which runs around here, and it runs around the Kairoa stream out here. So there's no drain as such that sits within the structure plan, which is effectively this. The drain runs down this way, another one along that stream here. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thanks, Mr. Desai. Can we start with you, Ms. Gibb, please?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No questions, but thank you very much for your clarification. I appreciate that.
Mr. Marg? Mr. Marg?
He's got his speaker off.
Ah, speaker. I lost connection.
That helps, sorry. Always helps.
Yeah, but my connection disappeared. Sorry about that, so I missed it.
That's all right, no problem. Any questions, Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions on that, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
So just one thing, I think somebody else asked it earlier in terms of the comment by the reporting officer around this site not having been identified within one of the growth Waikato 2070 growth areas, and whether Three Waters infrastructure was not suitably planned for. And I think somebody asked that of a different person, but what would your comments be about that?
I might be able to use the same picture on the screen. There's Kairoa stream, which runs down here. And with the growth plan, there's different growth areas that have been put forward, and there's some upgrades being proposed in terms of any of the culverts that needs to be upgraded. But in terms of this structure plan area, everything discharges down to this Oland flow path or tributary and goes down Kairoa. So there's no dependency on any infrastructure that needs to be provided. And it further goes down to River Waikato, and there's no upgrades in terms of infrastructure required. So there's no dependency as such.
What are the impacts on that stream?
So in terms, when we look at the impacts on the stream, there's two things which we look at generally. With the increased flows, there could be increased erosion scour issues. So the stormwater management approach has been proposed, and which follows the guidelines, which is looking at treating all the water. In terms of water quality, any trafficked areas, including roads, parking areas and driveways, are proposed to be treated, and that's going to be following the treatment train approach in form of at source or communal devices. And when we talk about attenuation, that is not proposed with the proximity sitting close to the Kairoa stream and the Tuakau swamp. And there's no works being proposed within the swamp itself or the stream extents.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I have no questions either. Thanks, Mr. Desai.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I think it must be Mr. Payne.
Yep, Ben Payne, please.
G'day, how's it going? I'll take my, can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll take my evidence as read and I'll just cover a couple of main points. In terms of water and wastewater servicing, they're both technically feasible for interim solutions and permanent solutions. The site is located directly adjacent to existing infrastructure, and the block to the directly adjacent to the site, the Dromgolds block, requires the same infrastructure upgrades that would be required to service this development. And that area is also supported by the Stranooth. In terms of the funding and for infrastructure upgrades, the cycle is quite regular, and within that within the live zoning window, that would that can be adaptive to the proposed development to enable infrastructure upgrades to service the site. And the site is relatively small compared to other developments within the proposed plan change. It's, yeah, happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
So are you saying that the infrastructure that's planned for the nearby site is going to have enough capacity for what's being planned here? Or proposed?
In terms of
wastewater?
Yeah, in terms of water and wastewater, the infrastructure proposed needs to happen for that development, as well as this one. And in terms of sizing, it hasn't been designed yet, so it can be designed to incorporate this development. And really, it depends on those upgrades depend on actual development versus proposed development. So obviously, that'll be adaptive and flexible enough to uptake what is actual development compared to planned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yes, Mr. Bone, have you had any direct contact with Watercare over this?
Yeah, we met with Waikato District Council, who became the members became Watercare Waikato. And generally they had very little information on the existing infrastructure, and they had some draft documentation on the and there was a couple of Becker's reports that went with that, which showed what infrastructure upgrades would be required, and they indicated there's no the design hadn't occurred, so there's nothing preventing additional capacity being added, which would be funded through infrastructure growth charges or development contributions.
So that's both water and wastewater, is it?
Yeah.
You're referring to both? Yeah.
So
okay.
in terms of the, since it hasn't been designed, it's hard to tell whether the proposal for the pipe sizes is correct. But if the development needed to, if in order to connect this development needed to increase the pipe size by one size up, then that would be covered by a development contribution.
Okay, thank you.
All very easy.
Yeah.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing for me, thanks.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, I have no questions. I think, thank you, Mr. Payne, you're adding bits to the jigsaw that's in my mind.
Ms. Gibb?
Yes, Mr. Payne, I kind of get the feeling there's an underlying implication, or yeah, it's implied that if the site nearby goes ahead, it helps this site go ahead. And it does seem to make sense if there was infrastructure being planned, it gets planned together, which is sort of what I picked up on the roading transport evidence too. So you know, in your opinion, I presume you think it makes sense to do it all at once, because adding or upgrading to a bigger pipe seems more expensive later on.
Yeah, it's likely that Watercare would make that pipe bigger now. You know, they're designed for a 100-year design life, so it makes sense that they'd build it to what it needs to be for the next 100 years, not build it for 10 years or 20 years.
I don't know, somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought I was told that if it's too big, you don't get the flow going down, but I'm presuming they know what they're doing, so it would all work out in the end.
The bigger the pipe, the bigger the flow.
Yes, but if it's a big pipe and very little flow, it wouldn't work, would it?
Yeah, it's water main. It's under pressure, and for sewer, it's also likely to be pumped from the site.
Okay.
So it's also under pressure, so the pressure will drive the flow.
Thanks, Mr. Payne. Very good.
Mr. Kearney? Mr. Kearney, anything from you?
No, thanks. No, I must be.
Just one from me, Mr. Payne. If we look at this the other way round, you've been talking about saying if this was live zone now, everything could be integrated with the upgrades that are proposed. If we look at it the other way and say this was, and Ms. Trenuth has suggested that this be future zoned, subject to another structure plan at a future time. If the infrastructure that's currently in the long-term plan to match the live zoning as it's currently proposed was all put in, and this proposal came along after that event. Now, I know it hasn't been designed yet, but what would you need to do? How affordable would it be, and how difficult would it be to implement?
It really depends on the design. There's many things you can do. Connect to the bulk infrastructure at a different point, so further down. So maybe run pipelines from further away. There's also on-site things that can be done, such as a pump station on site pumping off-peak. So when the main lines are not being worked as heavily, that's when the pumping from site occurs. So there are workarounds that we have used on other sites, and that can be put in place as interim measures until infrastructure upgrades allow for that to occur as a normal operation.
What would the upgrades be, though, in a situation like this, digging up a pipe and putting a bigger one down after the event instead of at the start?
Yeah, either upgrading pipes for duplication.
Right, okay. And if we work on the scenario that you needed to duplicate something in the future simply for this area, or the area that's proposed to be future zoned according to Ms. Trenuth, what would that do to the, well, what are the cost implications of doing that on the basis that this development on their own would need to sustain all those costs? Is that doable in this case, or does it render it difficult, if not impossible?
Again, it's hard to confirm based without a design. In terms of, say, a water main, a duplication of a main connecting to a further point further down, likely to be undertaken as in lieu of development contributions. So the developer undertakes that work in lieu of paying for other infrastructure. It all depends on the developer's agreement with Watercare and the council. Again, it's not, in terms of whether it stops development or not, but really, I don't think the zoning should stop it. It should be, if it becomes unaffordable, you know, changes in market prices and development, the cost to develop will determine whether they can whether they can build it or not, or whether they can build it or not in 2 or 3 years' time if the market, if the prices of houses change.
But that's the question I'm trying to ask you, not about the zoning, but about the realistic scenarios that might be faced if this were deferred zoning in the event that infrastructure was already put in for the surrounding land. Where would that leave this piece of land at the time your clients came along and said, right, it's now time to live zone this? Is it realistically possible
in terms of constructing,
to re-engineer this after the event, and not just in terms of connecting to pipes, but also in terms of capacity? Because your comments relate simply to the conveyance, as I read it, the conveyance of water to the site and wastewater from the site to and or from the main networks, and for example the wastewater treatment plant. Does this particular development stand alone on top of everything else, have capacity implications for infrastructure?
Again, with those capacity infrastructure, those capacity downstream constraints can be worked around by using pumping at, say, for wastewater pumping at off-peak times. So say normally the networks operating at a peak in the morning and the evening when people are at home cooking and showering and washing. But if you store the water within the site and then pump at 3 o'clock in the morning when the flows are low, then the capacity at the treatment plants aren't over, and the network isn't overrun. Similar with water, you can have a reservoir on site, a timber tank, which stores water during the peaks and pumps into the site off peaks. So there are workarounds in order to provide that, and we have done that on several sites around the place.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Payne. That's helpful. That's all for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll now turn to the planning.
Thanks, Mr. Oliver.
And just talk to my summary statement briefly. So I think as you've heard both from the evidence so far and from the 42A reporting as well, the kind of key issue that originally prevented this particular piece of land, or the land in the southwestern corner of Tuakau, from being zoned with a residential zone, was the potential reverse sensitivity effects, particularly from EnviroFert, but also to a lesser extent from Tuakau proteins. And I think what has actually become apparent over the last probably 5 years is that those concerns have now been overcome. And so that barrier to development has disappeared, and we're working really now on how to implement some additional land zoning without that particular constraint. So I think one of the key things I found as I worked my way through this, that result of being excluded from some of the growth planning documents, particularly Waikato 2070, as a result of that reverse sensitivity concern, has led to, I guess, what we might call a circular argument that even though the merits of the rezoning now appear to be very well supported, including in general by the Section 42A author, we still have a somewhat perverse outcome that it was excluded from the infrastructure planning at the time of Waikato 2070. As a result, that work hasn't flowed through into subsequent LTP planning, nor into kind of technical reporting through for this district plan review. So in my opinion, that circular argument kind of creates an unnecessarily inflexible approach. It seems to me the district plan review is the real opportunity to fix those issues. It's a time to correct anomalies and fill information gaps, and to ensure the most appropriate areas of land are urbanised to meet the demands for additional capacity, that's been outlined in Mr. Norgrove's evidence and also in the 42A report. The rezoning opportunity or process only happens around about every 10 years, potentially even longer. Can sometimes take 12 to 15 years to get a plan operative. And so this kind of comprehensive opportunity to look at the site and deal with it doesn't happen very often. And as pointed out by Mr. Norgrove, if the issue is infrastructure funding, then the LTP process is actually designed with a lot more flexibility, because it allows a 3-yearly review of the LTP, reconsideration of infrastructure funding. The result of that is a review of development contributions. And if that happens every 3 years, then you're able to essentially catch up with rezoning proposals, provided there's no absolutely fatal flaw around infrastructure, and I don't believe there is in this case. So I think that's the correct way to look at it, is to address the rezoning as on its merits, and then work with the infrastructure to fit into the rezoning as it becomes available. As Mr. Payne has pointed out, there are interim solutions available, and there are examples of other developments around where there is basically the developer is able to work with the council and with Watercare to come up with solutions that are eventually perfectly suitable. Just briefly commenting on the issue of high quality soils, which came up earlier on. I agree with the Section 42A report and Ms. Trenouth's view that the site's already compromised by fragmentation into small blocks. And I think the other issue is, perhaps hasn't come out so much yet, is that although it's partly outside the preliminary urban growth planning, the northern block, the Javan block, is actually included within the urban limits of Future Proof 2017. And the Geraghties Road frontage is shown as part of the Dromgolls block in Waikato 2070. So it's not as if the site is completely excluded, it's just that it doesn't have a blob sitting right over top of it, and the way some of the other ones are, it's just partly within and partly without. My view is this, the rezoning is very consistent with the NPS UD in terms of its ability to contribute to a well-functioning urban environment. One of the key issues for me from that point of view is the fact that it shares 320 metres of road frontage with Geraghties Road. Geraghties Road, existing public road, sealed road, obviously rural standard at the moment. But that 320 metres of road frontage is also shared by the Dromgolls growth block on the eastern side. And so it makes very logical development sense and efficiency sense that if you're going to develop and upgrade Geraghties Road and place infrastructure in the road and everything you do there, it makes more sense to be working on both sides of the road, developing both sides rather than one side only, i.e. Dromgolls first, and then come back later and then try and retrofit this Kirrimua block in later. It just doesn't make logical sense to me to be doing one-sided development and then trying to retrofit later. Also note that the NPS UD, apart from quite another number of supportive policies, it also requires councils to attempt to provide development capacity that's reasonably expected to be realised. So I think the Kirrimua land comprises a very good example of that, because it's just a small number of landowners, just 6. The neighbours have worked together to get a structure plan together. There are 3 large landowners, as I explained before, and 3 smaller ones. So it's quite a simple, straightforward structure plan. The Kirrimua trustee land is the central block, and that's the one that has the key access in from Geraghties Road, as Mr. Brookhausen explained earlier on. So it's well set up for staging, so that block would be the logical starting point to get in through the main road in, and then to develop the rear and the other adjoining properties as second stages. So this actually contrasts quite a lot with the Dromgolls block to the east. So the Dromgols block to the east is a very highly fragmented pattern of land parcels, as you will have seen from the cadastral plans that you've seen today. Multiple landowners, and it's also full of paper roads. So I understand that a lot of these subdivisions happened back in the 1950s and 60s, and they're largely 1 acre blocks, or actually no, I think 1,000 square meter blocks, a lot of them. So very difficult to I guess to pull together into a comprehensive structure. And there's also no structure plan for that cell at the moment. And so that, in my mind, makes it quite a difficult and time-consuming process to pull together the development on that side of the road to make it reasonably expected to be realised. As set out in Mr. Norgrove's evidence and also the 42A report, Tuakau does need additional live zoned residential land to provide sufficient supply. The NPS UD requires that in the medium term land in the NPS UD is defined as live zoned. So if it's going to be in the medium term, it really needs to be live zoned. In my opinion, this land needs to be live zoned in order to meet those obligations in the NPS UD and to ensure there's not a shortfall in capacity in that medium term 3 to 10 years. Just briefly turning to one question that was put to Mr. Balachandran just about how roading infrastructure upgrades might be funded, and particularly around DCs. So I think that the issue there is that essentially if in the next few years the upgrades become part of the LTP planning process and there's funding provided through that process, let's say in the 2024 LTP, then one of the outcomes of that would be that some development contributions would be developed out of that, which would then specify how each area of land contributed its share. Now, if development was to occur before then, or even sometimes in conjunction with that, the other way to do it would be through a developer agreement, which certainly in this case, the developers are quite aware of the processes for private developer agreements and accept that they will need to enter into one with the council to deal with infrastructure funding, particularly if any of it was going to be advanced before long-term plan funding was in place. So those would be the two methods that would be used to ensure that costs were shared equitably across all landowners and obviously across the council as well. So just in conclusion, my opinion is that the land is very well suited to rezoning. I don't consider, based on my understanding, that there are any fatal flaws in relation to wastewater and water servicing, which has been put up as the main barrier. And the site itself is very suitable because of its proximity to existing residentially zoned land and to Tuakau itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Let me see. Ms. Sedgwick, do you have any questions?
I have no questions, but thank you, Mr. Oliver, for remembering and answering those that I raised. I appreciate that.
Mr. Marg?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Oliver, and to your team. I have no questions.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions, but appreciate the clarity that we've been given today.
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Thank you. No question.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, what do you say about Waikato Regional Council's submission that this is high quality soil down there, and that land and the Buckland Road land should be it should be retained as rural land?
I think that's a very simplistic approach to that issue. I think you have to turn your mind to each particular case and address it in the context of the environment itself and also the statutory framework and obviously the policy framework. So you've got to put all those together. And I think my opinion of this site is that it is much less of an issue in terms of compromising highly productive soils than, for example, the Bucklands block. I mean, that's partially just its area. Obviously, this is only about some 25, 28 hectares of developable land, fragmented into smaller properties, and also bisected by the gully system and has those other site constraints as well. I mean, I'm not closely familiar with the Bucklands land, but just from driving up Bucklands Road and looking at the land uses there, and also the size of the blocks as well. They seem to be much larger blocks, probably more like 30, 40 hectare blocks, quite a few of them, so much less fragmented. So I would say there's perhaps more of an issue there, but I don't see in this case that I guess that opinion from the regional council creates a significant problem, because simply the size of this, the fragmentation, and also the fact that if you go back to the draft NPS on highly productive land that's kind of been working its way through the system through MFE and MB, it talks about areas that are that have been identified for growth as potentially being excluded from that policy. So that kind of gives an initial policy direction about some thinking around the significance of urban development versus protection of highly productive soils.
Okay, thank you.
Just one from me, Mr. Oliver, and it wasn't clear from your evidence what your position on whether the structure plan that's been proposed, whether that should or shouldn't be in the district plan. You've mentioned that it could be, but I'm not sure that you've made a specific recommendation, and I'd invite you to do that now.
Yes, I think possibly not in my summary, but in my evidence in chief, I did recommend, I think, that the structure plan be included in the district plan, and obviously from other reporting processes, Section 42A reporting processes that you'll be aware of, there is a move to include references in the district plan to site-specific structure plans that can then be added. So obviously you would need that decision to be made as well to go alongside it, because that would include a generic rule that said something like that any development of this land shall be in accordance with the structure plan.
No, that's fine. I was looking at your primary statement, and you said those other provisions would be complemented by including the structure plan and the district plan, which seemed to me to be one step short of saying you thought it was necessary, but you've clarified that now, so thank you for that. And I don't have any further questions. There's nothing further from the panel. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Oliver. That's very helpful.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody. I think that brings us to the end of today. So we'll adjourn until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, when we'll hear from some further submitters. I think on that basis, then we'll adjourn, and if the panel wouldn't mind waiting for a moment or two, please.